This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. After 18 months in office, Argentine President Javier Milei has enjoyed significant success in reducing inflation and getting the country's finances in order. On today's podcast, we'll look at President Milei's pending challenges, including upcoming midterm elections and an economy that still feels tough for many Argentines.
You're having a society that has been patient and willing to give Milei the opportunity to implement his economic plan, but that they're showing resistance and they're showing some level of rejection to his cultural advances, especially when it comes to pensions for all older people, when it comes to gay rights, etc.
President Javier Milei has carved out a huge profile on the global stage. Donald Trump has called him his favorite president. Milei's unapologetic vows to take a chainsaw to government spending has made him a hero to much of Silicon Valley, as well as austerity-minded leaders around Latin America. But at home, the picture is more complex. Inflation has fallen sharply, now running at 47% over the last 12 months, down from a stunning 211% when President Milei took office. Milei recently reached a $20 billion agreement with the International Monetary Fund. He lifted currency controls sooner than many expected. But imbalances in the economy remain, and more than half of Argentina's population is still living below the poverty line after the spending cuts of recent years. Add it all up, and President Milei's approval rating remains pretty steady at around 50% or just below, and you really get the sense that this story could still go either way. That President Milei could build on his early successes and oversee a once-in-a-generation positive change for Argentina, or that he could lose momentum and public support, perhaps paving the way for the left to potentially increase its power following midterm elections this October. To try to gauge which way we're headed, we've invited a frequent guest who always helps us sort through these trends, the political consultant Ana Iparraguirre. Ana, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
It's good to be back. Thank you very much for having me.
Ana, with President Milei, it seems like there is always so much activity, so many fireworks, so much of a show. But if we take a calm step back, what is his overall political standing after a year and a half in office?
Well, first, I would say that if you're taking anything calm, you would not be Argentine. But we're going to leave that aside and say that I think there's three things going on. The first one, there's clearly been progress, economic progress in terms of scaling down inflation. And that's something that Argentines really appreciate after the past few years. And that's Milei's biggest accomplishment. The second thing is a complete collapse of the political parties that we knew or coalitions that we knew up until 2023. And so he's having no resistance, no real opposition, a lot of fragmentation. And the third thing that I would say is that you're having a society that has been patient and willing to give Milei the opportunity to implement his economic plan, but that they're showing resistance and they're showing some level of rejection to his cultural advances, especially when it comes to pensions for all older people, when it comes to gay rights, etc. I think we're seeing some rejection from civil society there.
I want to talk a little bit about the economy. He has enjoyed more success there than most people expected at the beginning of his term. Inflation is down, as you know. Real wages have recently begun to recover somewhat. He recently reached a $20 billion agreement with the International Monetary Fund. But do ordinary, everyday Argentines feel a recovery yet?
Well, that is certainly the question. Argentines are not feeling that recovery. In fact, one of the things that we hear often from voters today and from citizens is, well, is inflation really going down? Because when I go to the supermarkets, the prices are still increasing. Clearly, the inflation rate is going down, and that's what economists are talking about. But real people out there in the real world are saying, prices are still higher when I go to the supermarket. So there's some tension there between what the statistics are saying and what people are feeling in their pockets. And I would say also that, some of them are starting to question whether this economic model of Milei is really going to be beneficial to them personally. And what we are seeing is that for the first time in many years, the main concern for Argentines in terms of public opinion is no longer inflation, and we're seeing more and more concern about corruption and transparency. And so I think, as people start to feel that inflation is under control, they're going to start to demand more institutional accountability to the president and the new government.
I was interested to see some polling numbers recently that showed President Milei's approval rating still broadly stable, a little bit below 50%, no big changes there. But at the same time, and this reflects, Anna, the point that you were just making, when they were asked about whether things are getting worse or better on issues like economic activity, public health, public education, and so on, there was general agreement that things are getting worse. And so my question for you is, and we've asked this on this podcast a lot in the pages of America's Quarterly as well, what is your latest explanation for why so many people are still standing by President Milei and supporting him, even if they've not seen tangible progress in some of these other areas yet?
There are many reasons, but if I had to pick one reason that I think is the strongest one, is there's no alternative. The alternative right now is going back to Kirchnerismo or a revised version of Peronism. The Cambiemos coalition has completely fragmented. What you're seeing in the elections that are going to be on May 18th in the city of Buenos Aires is like a political fight between two political parties, saying everything at each other that has nothing to do with what voters really care about. And so there's a complete dissociation between what voters want and what the political system is offering. So much so that what we have seen in the 5 provinces that have had elections this year is a big decline in voter participation.
I want to come back to what's happening in the opposition and specifically Kirchnerismo. But before we do, let me ask you about President Milei's base. You're a pollster. Who is standing by him most solidly in terms of either demographics or political orientation?
Well, that's very interesting because Milei's vote is neither stable nor monolithic. So what you see is an inner circle who are the early adopters, and those tend to be young voters, mostly men, young men. And then you see a second sphere of adoption, and that includes 2 groups. One group are former Cambiemos, pro radicales, or whatever it is, people who used to vote for Cambiemos that are now moving towards Milei, and those tend to be older voters.
That's the old Argentine center-right, people who supported President Mauricio Macri during his term, essentially.
Correct. And then you have another block of voters that I think it's very interesting to look at, and they tend to be underlooked by Argentines who are focused in Buenos Aires City and Buenos Aires province, which is groups from the urban interior of Argentina, of the different provinces, who tend to be more former Peronists, who tend to be a mix of younger and older voters, lower income, lower education, and those are also part of Milei's coalition.
And who has he lost?
It's very hard to say because it fluctuates from survey to survey because they're very small groups. But what we have seen so far is that he's losing some of the lower income, lower education, former Peronist base that he had in Buenos Aires. in the city of Buenos Aires as well as in the province of Buenos Aires, and also some of the more institutional vote that you just mentioned, former Cambiemos, like middle class, former, center-right, who don't like that Milei picked up someone as Lijo as a candidate for the Supreme Court, who's, questioned about his transparency, who don't like that just last week Argentina had a vote on the Ficha Limpia that would require that candidates that have a judicial problem, like Cristina Kirchner, for example, would not be able to run for office. And that fell. And many say that that was Milei's fault. And so I think there's a group of people who are looking at that and they say, like, not so much. I'm not so sure that I agree with all that. And I'm willing to, weigh my options.
For our listeners who maybe don't follow Argentine politics on a day-to-day basis, how has President Milei spoken about this insufficient recovery so far? I know that he celebrates the decline in inflation, some other economic indicators that are moving in the right direction, but has he also acknowledged that when it comes to people's salaries and some of these other indicators that show up in polls, that people still need to be patient? How is he speaking to his base about these issues?
Absolutely not. He's following Trump's manual. I don't know if you saw the movie The Apprentice, where his lawyer explains to him that the first rule is deny, 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 right? So he's absolutely denying that that's a fact. He's fighting with every journalist, every economist who dares to question his economic model, surrounded by a group of people and ministers who will defend the program no matter what.
We'll be back after a short break. Hey, it's Brian Winter. If you're in New York on May 19th, we've got a treat for you. Please join America's Society for discussion with the legendary New Yorker staff writer John Lee Anderson. John Lee, he's John Lee. I think this audience knows him well. Author of the definitive biography of Che Guevara and a longtime reporter on numerous other Latin America-related topics. The conversation will be open to the public. Afterward, there will be a meet and greet with John Lee with wine and appetizers for our valued members of the Americas Society. You can register on our website. That's as-coa.org. That's as-coa.org. So let's talk about what's happening on the other side. Your answer to my earlier question about President Milei's popularity being partly at least the result of a lack of a viable alternative. 6 months into his government, that answer made sense to me. 18 months out, it's surprising to me that no opposition has really kind of gathered force, especially given some of these very real pending challenges. So what is happening within Peronism, within the Kirchnerista faction of Peronism, and why have they been unable, apparently, to articulate a compelling counter-argument, let's say, to voters?
Well, I think, both Cambiemos, or El PRO, basically Mauricio's Macri party within Cambiemos, El PRO, as well as the Peronist party, they are debating what the next phase of the party is going to be and what it has to look like. And I believe that the reason why they can't really put forward a clear path is that they have not decided what 2023 meant. And so let me just talk a little bit more about that. But so in terms of Mauricio Macri, his interpretation is I lost, or we lost, our party lost, because we became too soft. We became too left-wing. We were not defending the right-wing ideas that we should be defending. And so we have to become more right-wing. The problem is that when he did that, the space that he wanted to occupy was already occupied by Milei. And also, I think he fails to acknowledge that the coalition that brought him to power was a combination of, center-left and center-right voters. And you can see right now in the city of Buenos Aires, where many of these center-left voters who used to support Mauricio Macri's party are now moving into other options that they have available, like Horacio Rodríguez Larreta, who's now no longer part of that party. So that on the side of Cambiemos. Then Peronists are trying to also decide what their future looks like. So you have Kirchneristas, because of selfish reasons, but also because of how they understand the political system, who say we have to, double bet on, our identity and become more left-wing and more radical. And we have to double bet on Cristina and go with that. And then you have another faction of Peronist party. And you can see that, debate going on in the elections that are going to happen in the province of Buenos Aires. But you have another faction of the party that is saying, no. What we need to do is to reform this party, try to be broader, try to detach from the past and understand that, in order to have a future, we first need to acknowledge that we need to stabilize the economy, that inflation is not right. We have to make sort of a mea culpa of some of the economic flaws of our program. And you can see that happening right now in the elections that are going to happen May 18th in the city of Buenos Aires, where the Peronist party is going with a candidate who used to be a radical, like Leandro Santoro, with a very different strategy of what you're seeing in the province of Buenos Aires.
Ana, is it too egocentric of me to notice the clear parallels with what's happening in the Democratic Party in the United States right now? Or is this not a coincidence at all?
Not at all. I think it's the exact same situation where there's no, diagnosis of what happened in the election last year. And so now they're trying to figure that out, and you have competing forces. Now, let me tell you one big difference with Argentina. And the big difference is the following. Democrats will eventually have a primary that will allow them to decide this. Argentina this year eliminated the PAS, which were the mandatory primaries. They no longer exist. So these parties that don't have an institutional knowledge, an institutional way of solving these problems, we're left now without the external way that they had to sort out these problems. So they don't have a way to solve that until they go to an election and they see what faction wins and how things turn out. And so that debate is becoming a lot harder in Argentina. And on top of that, I'm going to add one more thing, that is that in Argentina, you have stages because it is a multi-party system as opposed to the US. It's very difficult in the US. If you don't like the Democratic candidate of your choice, you would have to jump. Well, you have some independent candidates, but mostly you would have to jump all the way over to your enemies, to the opposite side. It's very hard to do that. It really takes a lot for someone to do that change. But in Argentina, you don't like the candidate that Macri is offering? Well, you can vote for Larreta, who's still there. You don't like Milei? Well, you've got the PRO. You've got options that you don't really have in the US. So that makes the political system, I think we're going into a phase that is going to be a very, very fragmented political arena.
You mentioned former President Cristina Kirchner. Talk to me about her. What has she been up to and how does she fit into all of this?
Well, Cristina Kirchner is very threatened legally, right? And I think her biggest threat was like this Ficha Limpia law that ended up not happening this past week in Argentina. And because that would have banned her from being a candidate. And as you know, once you can't really run for office, it's very difficult to, keep power and maintain the appearance of power. But the rumor is, and we still don't know, that Cristina Kirchner will be a candidate, not for president, not for governor, not for senator, not for representative. She's going to be a candidate for state representative of one section of the province of Buenos Aires. So what has become of this huge leader? Well, she's now president of the Peronist party, which she always said it was vintage and it didn't really serve any purpose. So she's now president of that party, and she's going to be running for state representative of one section of one province of Buenos Aires. Well, she's doing that because she's basically in the middle of a non-primary primary with Axel Kicillof in the province of Buenos Aires, who's disputing her main territory, which is the province of Buenos Aires, and saying, okay, I'm going to go with my candidates, with my lists, and I'm going to be the future of the Peronist party. And I'm not going to be like Alberto Fernandez, who was a former president, who was basically selected by Cristina, a unique case where the vice president selected the president for the ticket. And so he's like, I'm going to be independent. And so they're having that dispute And she's like, okay, you want to be it, but you're going to have to beat me in order to be the leader of the province of Buenos Aires. So I'm going to be the person you're going to have to beat. Now, the lists have not been confirmed yet, so this might change, but that's what everyone is saying right now, that she's going to end up being a candidate. And the same thing is happening to Mauricio Macri. Mauricio Macri, who used to lead this big coalition, is now fighting for a fraction of his votes in the city of Buenos Aires. And so I think Argentines have decided, they have moved past this, they have moved past this big choice that defined votes, which was you're either Kirchnerista or non-Kirchnerista. And they're saying, okay, that no longer is what defines our vote, what defines our minds. And so these candidates are finding it hard to find a meaning for their candidacies and their political power and their political leadership in today's political reality in Argentina.
Let me ask you a couple of questions about the outlook for President Milei going forward. The first one, you mentioned earlier that voter concerns seem to be shifting away from the economy and more towards transparency. I want to ask you about this incident back in February in which President Milei posted on X promoting a new cryptocurrency. The cryptocurrency's value quickly inflated and then plummeted again. President Milei later deleted the tweet. The case has been called Cryptogate. What is your reading of how that crisis affected him? And are there any enduring consequences from this now almost 3 months later?
Yes, I think that was a bit of a turning point that affected Milei in some of the core attributes of his, personality. And so, one is the credibility. So if this guy is the expert on the economy that he claims to be, how come he didn't realize that this was a scam? So either he's not as smart as he told us he was, or he's got something at stake in this decision that made him make that decision. On top of that, after that incident, Milei gave a media interview where his main advisor, Santiago Caputo, was filmed coming into the interview and telling Milei what to say and negotiating the questions with the journalist who was conducting the interview. And that, again, is a problem for his main attribute that we've talked about several times, right? Authenticity. So if he's so authentic and says what's in his mind, why does he have an advisor telling him what to say? Why is he negotiating the questions with the journalist? So, and in fact, you saw since that incident in public opinion, especially the Ditela index, you saw a progressive decline that happened 4 months in a row. And it seems to be a little bit more stabilized right now, but that's when it happened. And I'm going to add on top of that I think it's not a small deal what happened a week ago with the Ficha Limpia law, where Milei said he supported it. He said he had the votes. They claimed to have the vote. And there were two senators from Misiones, who last minute decided to vote against this bill. And the whole report in the media is that this was a negotiation between these senators from the Peronist Party and Milei in order not to vote for the Ficha Limpia because he didn't want that bill to become law. So I think all this is slowly eroding some of the key attributes. And that's very important in someone like Milei, because Milei, and this connects with the point that you made at the beginning of this conversation, which is why are people, still holding on to Milei, even though, the economy, they're still suffering. And they're holding on because they believed in him. They believed he had good intentions. He was going in the right direction. But if he's not really doing that, then why I'm going to continue to suffer and support him? He needs to be very exemplary for people to continue to say, okay, this is tough on me, but I'm still going to support you because I know you're leading us to a better tomorrow, to a better future.
And important to note that President Milei has denied any kind of wrongdoing with regard to the cryptocurrency incident. Let me ask you about the foreign policy sphere. Everyone knows that President Milei has developed a special relationship with Donald Trump. Donald Trump has referred to him as his favorite president. What has all that looked like from the perspective of everyday Argentines? I mean, is his relationship with President Trump seen as an asset? And what has it meant in practice for the Javier Milei brand in Argentina?
Yeah. Well, I'd say first that regular Argentines are not really thinking about the relationship between Milei and the US, right? Now, it did have two consequences that I think are very important. The first is obviously, the agreement with the IMF that provided the dollars that the government needed to stabilize the economy, and the fact that that the U.S. has said after that agreement was funded with the IMF that if Argentina had any challenges, the Treasury would actually provide an additional loan to Argentina to be able to survive any instability that may happen. So that's, the positive aspect of it, and that's very clear. But on the other hand, I think, the world has become a lot more unstable. And when the world is unstable, people don't want to go into, markets that are more risky to invest. And so Milei's government gained from that support. But at the same time, the world has become less interested in investing in a country like Argentina in a more unstable world. So both things are going on at the same time. And I think we still don't know which one is going to have a heavier weight at the end of the day. In terms of the public opinion, I'd say, we know Argentines have a much better opinion of the U.S. than of Donald Trump. That's a fact. They don't, most Argentines don't really like Trump, but most Argentines do like the U.S. and they believe, an alliance of Argentina with the U.S. is a good thing. And so I think that tension is something that's also, evident when you ask people about this relationship. They think it may be beneficial to Argentina, but some also start to question whether, what's going on in the relationship between Milei and Argentina. Is it really what's better for Argentina, or is it really what's better for Trump?
Ana, thank you so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.